back there. This is the Show Me the Money panel. So hopefully you're in the right place. Encourage you to move forward if you would like, but kind of have an intimate group. We hope it will be interactive. Expect a lot of participation. And we have a great panel today to talk about generating revenue in an open source business model. So whether you're starting your own business or whether you're incorporating and leveraging some open source within to scale and grow within your current business model, that's great. Startup or large enterprise. We're going to talk about some of the revenue models today, keys to success, what's working, what's not. Kind of talk through why now, where we're going to go, and what we can do to protect the integrity of open source going forward as we monetize. And so, again, please ask questions. We have a small group. We'd love to have your input. You're here to learn not only from the panel, but from one another. So please participate. We're a little bit short on time. We ended a little bit late, so we will go till 11:20. We've got a few things to get through, but I'll try to keep us moving along. But if there are certain things that you'd like to cover, specific questions that you have, please feel free. So by way of quick introduction, I'm Nicole Whitehead. I work at a family office private equity firm in Salt Lake City called Dakota Pacific. And we're seeing more and more of this type of investment activity within the open source industry as far as having businesses valued, not only they're being seen as not only viable investment opportunities, but incredibly profitable opportunities. And so this is an exciting area for us, and really excited to see what your community is doing to evolve a number of different industries. So, and here on our panel, I'm sure you guys know them as well, but we've got Matt Asay here, VP of Strategy and Business Development at MongoDB. We've got Gabe Gunderson, co-founder and CTO at Izeni. And we've got Devlin Daley, pinch hitting here for Howard. Thank you very much for stepping in. He is co-founder at Instructure. So we will let them continue to introduce themselves, and as their experience will come out as we talk through some of these questions. But given the time, I just want to jump in and, like I said, talk through, with news of more and more open source companies raising hundreds of millions of dollars for funding. Just ask you guys specifically, what's happening in the industry now that has the markets finally ready to accept and value open source, startups as real businesses, and poised for sustainable long-term growth?
I'll take that one because it's easy.
Okay. Why now?
I think that one of the reasons that investors are interested in it is because they have seen some wins. So investors like to see things that they know will pay out eventually, because that's why you invest. Mm-hmm. And so there's been some very high-profile companies that have succeeded with that model. And so when you come in, it's not necessarily about open source. It's you actually refer to the companies that have already succeeded with it. So you don't say like, oh, we're an open source company, we're going to be successful. You say, no, we're going to be like the Red Hat of this industry, and then that's what is attractive to people.
Yeah, and I would actually go even one step further. I think that's correct. So I've been involved in various open source businesses for about 15, 16 years. And we've gone through a few different waves. The first, one wave and I missed this wave. I keep missing the waves. Is when I was at Alfresco, an open source content management company, all the companies around us, JBoss, SpringSource, et cetera, they were all being acquired for $300+ million. And that was interesting and good. What's changed now is that it's not enough. What we're seeing is a tectonic shift in how companies of all kinds use open source. And we're seeing with Hadoop, with my company MongoDB, with others, we're seeing a complete shift in the infrastructure that undergirds the entire industry. So Hadoop, Cloudera, up until Cloudera raised $740 million, we were the best financed of any of the open source companies. MongoDB, we had just raised $150 million, which we thought was a lot of money.
That is a lot of money.
And it was until you have Cloudera raise that much. And the reason is you think that's an insane amount of money. But when you look at what's at stake, when you look at 30, 40 years people building their data warehouses with relational databases, et cetera, and the industry moving away from that, then you see that maybe they didn't raise enough. Like there's actually so much at stake that we're talking tens of hundreds of billions of dollars at stake that they may have gone too small.
So I wish this worked. Oh, I wish I knew how to use technology. That's what I really wish. Hardware, that's right. So I wish there were more time, actually, because I'd love to play the devil's advocate. I think open source has already been accepted by and large in the industry. If you're talking about open source in general, not just open source business models. Now, I think nobody is more qualified to speak to open source business models than Matt here. But if you look at Instructure, it's not about an open source business model. It's about building a business on open source. And I think that's gotten to the point today where if you are not leveraging open source tools like MongoDB or Cassandra or Nginx or Chef or Salt or any of these things, then you're just insane, right? So I think whether or not open source businesses or business models are being accepted, to me, isn't that relevant, because I don't have to sell that to my clients. But on the other hand, I wouldn't build anything for my clients unless it leveraged all of the value and power that open source delivers. And these are typically things that are offered as a service and not distributed themselves. And so sometimes the license isn't as important. I know I'm probably going to get burned at the stake here when I leave. But that's the nature of this world. Things are changing quite a bit.
Was that an anti-GPL comment?
No, I love the GPL. I love it for what it does, but I don't think it's surprising at all that the GPL is being smoked by the BSD and the MPL and the Apache and whatever less heavy-handed license I haven't mentioned.
Yeah, actually, and I would agree with you on that. What you said about who are the real beneficiaries. So Peter Goldmacher, this fantastic analyst with Cowen and Company, wrote about the three groups that really benefit from this shift that I talked about before. One, he said, is the companies like Cloudera, like MongoDB. It's great. They'll make money. Some of us will IPO. It's fantastic. The next are the companies that are building these services, usually as SaaS, on open source. And it's Salesforce, Amazon, AWS is an example of heavily depends on open source. Google is another example. Google could not exist without open source.
Facebook, Twitter,
Twitter, etc. That's the next. And they're the even bigger beneficiaries. But the real beneficiaries, and I think this goes to your point, Gabe, is Zions Bank. It's companies, organizations, individuals who aren't in the business of selling software, maybe Instructure, but are in the business of they're in some other kind of business, and they will depend on Hadoop. They will depend on these technologies, and most of it is going to be open source. Like, you would be insane at this point to create a proprietary database. There's just, it's the dumbest idea like anyone could possibly come up with.
Let's see if Oracle does it, though. Then maybe they're going to pull another trick out of their bag. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense anymore. That's not the way that we that's not the way that we build software. You can find it for something like Splunk. There are examples, but by and large, it's open source.
No, I think the infrastructure is definitely open source, and I'm curious to see how far up the stack it's going to go, right? Because as you get applications that, infrastructure has to be open source, but applications on top of that don't necessarily today, and I think that's going to be kind of the next wave.
So I've seen some interesting things in that. I'm not a huge fan of the AGPL, but I think it has its place, and I think in the early days, I think Sugar CRM, for example, got a lot of mileage out of the fact that it was freely downloadable and open source. But I think that's when that mattered and was a differentiator. Now that it's not, now that everything is almost assumed to be open source and downloadable, it feels like companies are pulling back from that. Almost like they've leveraged the benefit of distribution that gives them and the mind share that they grab. And now they're like, well, if you run this and change it in any way and host it, we want those changes back. And I actually see Also, a little bit of backlash in companies that require, so attribution, well, if I contribute to your GPL project and I license it under GPL, but I keep the copyright, that works in a lot of cases, but there are companies where that doesn't work. And I sense a little bit of backlash is a strong word, but hesitancy in the community to say, well, if I give it back to you in GPL, those are the same terms under which you gave it to me. And I'm not that interested in assigning or giving attribution to your company so you can turn around and private license it or whatever. And so I think some of the good old days of open source and distributing things are behind us, and that it's more like the Linux kernel in my mind. Everybody benefits from a better kernel, so you either throw in at an infrastructure level or the low level, or you maybe are pulling back a little bit. I don't know.
I think some of that, it takes some time to reap some of the benefits, right? And I think, I agree with you that, because I went through this ourselves, that, the open source of, like, Instructure was a big, it was very important. But, like, as over time it's become, I think, maybe less important from a marketing perspective, but from a standpoint in the market, absolutely not.
I completely forgot that your product is open source. Congratulations, good for you. I'm sorry, I was laboring under the assumption that you were using open source, but I remember now that you guys open sourced it. I don't follow the education space too closely.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't follow me.
And we used to be friends, but
Okay.
Oh, hey, there's probably a good reason for that.
yeah, there is.
So, I don't blame them. I don't love it, but I don't blame them.
No, thank you. This next question, I think, is geared more specifically for some key takeaways for you specifically as far as what they've learned. There are a lot of different types of monetization models out there, and so I'd like them to talk about specific examples that you've seen. What's working, why, what are they doing right, what are you doing right, and maybe what are some of the keys to sustaining that success as you try to generate revenue in this?
Never charge for open source software. That would be, I mean, if you want a key takeaway, and I work for a company that does, and we're doing very well. But if you want to see again, who are the big beneficiaries, who makes the most money from open source? MongoDB will do a lot of money this year, but Facebook will do orders of magnitude more. Google will do orders of magnitude more. That's where the money is. It's building services on top of open source. So you can make money, and you can actually make a really good living. If you do it really well, like a Red Hat, you can make $1 billion a year selling support and services around open source. But that's the exception, really, not the rule. And for a while we thought, and to your point, Devlin, earlier about how far up the stack it'll go, well, I worked up the stack for, content management is sort of middleware infrastructure, but mostly application. And the closer you get to the application, the less relevant it is that it's open source, because they just want something that works. They don't necessarily want to go in and mess with the code or anything. But it's hard charging for support for an open source application. When's the last time anyone paid for OpenOffice or LibreOffice, or maybe you're generous souls who have done that. So you've donated to Michael Meeks. And
super generous if you paid for LibreOffice.
But you probably haven't. And so the real model, I think, going forward is you just bypass the monetization becomes the service that you're generating for somebody else, and that makes it really clean. That's why Facebook can give away everything. That's why they can be so amazingly, I don't want to say generous, because they're doing it for self-interest, for self-interested reasons, but it's why they can participate so openly and open source everything, including their data centers, because that's not where they're making their money. That makes it really clean. It makes it easy to be a good open source citizen when you're not running into this conflict that I think, Gabe, you alluded to earlier, where you want to open source most of what you have, but not quite. You'll have some features held back, and I've tried that model, and it works okay. But again, the best model is when it's completely divorced from how your software is divorced from what you're charging for.
Yeah, so I can think of, like, I don't know if it's still true because I'm not a big MySQL user, but, when Oracle started holding back a few things instead of putting them into MySQL, I was like, that's it. I'm done. I don't even care what they do anymore. It's not relevant to me because as an open source user, that really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. And while I'm on Oracle, I think there's that same feeling with VirtualBox, which is a great, handy little virtualization platform. But to leave certain stuff back, like the USB 2 support or whatever it is, I don't know. I'm ready to take a pass if that's how they're playing. It sounds pretty lame. I mean, it maybe is, but
no. Okay, so I'll say a few things. Okay, so I co-founded Instructure, and then I'm not an Instructure anymore, so I'm not speaking for the company here. Okay, and Matt actually helped us out a couple years ago, and I'm depressed that you don't remember, but.
Well, if you
used to be friends too.
If you would have said that was the call, I do remember the Instructure call.
Oh, that was me. Okay, and I think that there is a very difficulty in having an open source product and then and selling it. And I agree with Matt completely that it is around the service of it. Right? You're not selling the software, but you're selling the service of it. But the service of it could be simply just you hosting it and backing it up and redundancy and everything with it. Now you do have to walk kind of this line of do you hold something out or don't you? Because you don't want to alienate somebody like Gabe, right? And I think the
people
key
alienate me all the time. Don't worry about it.
And Matt, actually, you gave me this advice years ago. Is that you need to give people a reason why to buy your product, because they're going to come at the end of the year and they say, "Why are we paying for this? Isn't that free? Isn't that open source?" And you have to give them a very good reason to just say, "This is why we're paying for it. Well, we're paying for hosting, we're paying for mobile support, or we're just paying for support, period." It just has to be a very simple explanation. And that worked out fantastic, thank you. And
I'm glad you didn't say here in front of everyone.
Yeah, it worked out.
That was the crappiest advice I ever got.
And but I think with it is that the key is alignment, right? Is that if you're holding out something that goes against what your customers are trying to do with the product, then that's when you run into problems where they feel like, well, you're holding back on me. But if you are holding back something that is aligned with them, and I'll give you an example of this. So in education space, there's these huge proprietary systems. They're called student information systems, how you sign up for classes. And they are proprietary, and they feel that integration with them is also proprietary. And so actually, you cannot open source it, even if you wanted to. Right? And so that's an easy one to say, well, we can't open source it anyway, and so that's one of the things that you're paying for is for this proprietary integration.
That's perfectly respectable. I mean, even for the most narrow-minded open source advocates like myself.
Yeah. But it's aligned as that's what I'm paying for, and you're not, you avoid that kind of awkwardness.
So I as I think back and remember Instructure's earlier days, and we started out in the same cubicles almost. I would love to hear because I remember there was a time when it wasn't open source and you said, this is a big deal, we're going to make that change. Was that before Josh Coates came on? Or was it shortly after? Or what was more specifically, what did that do for your business?
All right, I didn't want to dominate the discussion, so I'll be very brief, okay, is that Brian and I started Instructure while we were students, and our original business model was to go open source, but it was in 2008, and there wasn't a whole lot of open source companies that were being very successful yet, and so investors didn't understand it, and so we had to, we didn't pitch that to the investors because they didn't get it yet, and I think that's something that has drastically changed since 2008. I mean, that was a while back. And they understand that you can be successful with it, and there's very good reasons for going open source.
So it was open source the whole time. It just wasn't presented that way.
We wanted to go open source, but then we could not justify it to to investors when we were trying to raise money, and so we kept it closed source, but trying to find a way to do it. And what we ended up with is, again, it was alignment. We had to come up with, it wasn't just we're being open source just for open source sake. We were doing it because it allowed us to actually attract the market. And so for us specifically is that it was something that we were able to do as a company that our competitors would never be able to do. It gave us a long-term competitive advantage that they could never copy. And so when that alignment made sense, because we were in a market that would, if you were successful at all, you'd either get sued or you'd get bought. And so what was important to schools that we were selling to was freedom. It actually was freedom to be in control of their own destiny. And so that's why open source was perfectly aligned with our business model. And so we were able to do that, and we did that when Josh came on.
Very good. Appreciate you sharing that.
So actually, and I'm going to ask you to dominate the discussion for a little bit more, because I find it really interesting. For Instructure, why would freemium not have been equally as good as open source? Why did the open source aspect matter?
Well, a couple of reasons is that we were dealing with universities who have, they actually have resources to build these things themselves or to host them and run them. And so, some schools do and some schools don't, right? And so it wasn't about the free cost of it, is that they want support. So we expected that most schools would adopt the open source, and then only a small percentage of them would actually adopt supported and pay us for it. We actually found it was completely the opposite. Everyone purchases it. So we have 600 paying customers and like 100 open source people using the open source. And it was actually opposite because they needed all the things that we provide from enterprise support to the hosting and uptime, and someone to take on that liability from a legal point of view. They needed that and they wanted that. And so, and at the same time though, they need to be in control of their destiny, so that if we went in a different direction than they wanted, or we made a business decision to join another company or an IPO or another direction, that they would still be able to do it. And so this is where I'm saying, like, most schools don't buy it because of the open source, but in the long term, that's actually it's hard to understate how important that was.
It's part of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
Your commitment to an open source product
That's right.
opened up the conversation, but they're willing to pay the premium service to make sure they're in business.
I mean, like, we've passed the point where any of our competitors could actually purchase Instructure because we've just grown too big too fast. But yet, I'm not even at Instructure. I went and gave a talk in Maryland last week, and I still had people coming up and say, how do we know that Blackbird's not going to buy you? And it's like, well, we don't want to. And they're like, yeah, whatever. And like, oh, fine, we're open source and we're a poison pill. And like, oh, I finally get it. Okay, sweet.
And actually, so I was, in a way, I was being devil's advocate on that question, because there is something. Richard Stallman used to talk about free as in freedom, not free as in beer or milk, since that's my preferred drink here. I don't want to offend anyone.
Root beer.
I am from Utah County originally, so I did grow up drinking milk. But there is something. It actually does matter that it's open. It does matter that, if you're selling software as a service, then freemium is the absolute right model, because if you open source, if you give away the code, it kind of doesn't make sense in that model. But and companies like Sugar CRM have tried doing both, like having, you can run it as a service, but you can download it, and it just kind of didn't work. But for businesses like mine, where it's a database, people want to download it. They want to try it. And we could make a completely proprietary free database and say, only pay us when you reach this amount of scale or something like that. It wouldn't work. For a variety of reasons, it really matters that it's open. Part of it is who your user is that's initially touching, and it's often developers. In our case, it's certainly developers. But part of it is that trust. There is a level of trust that you establish with that person on the other end of the download that you don't have if you're basically saying, it's mine, you can use it, but only so much, and then you must pay me. With open source, you're saying it's yours. And when you're ready for whatever reasons, whether it's functionality that you may need or support or something else, then you come to me. But it puts the customer, the user, in control, and it matters a lot. It's not just about free as in milk. It's free as in freedom, and it really, really does matter.
Milk's far from free these days. It's pretty expensive.
Especially if you use Winder. But
yeah.
Will you restate the question?
It was just asking, like, what are the keys to success as you're...
And he said, don't charge for it.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, don't expect people to contribute. Anytime I've ever talked to somebody who's open sourced, I think their expectation that they'll get contributions is corrected really quickly after they release the code. It's going to be quiet for a long, long, long time unless unless it happens to be kind of a sexy project and people are interested in it anyway.
But even then, like you look at MySQL, fantastic project. But I remember Mark Mikos getting up on stage and showing this, these circles. Largest circle was their user community, and he said it was like 1,000 to 1. So imagine 1,000 people in this big balloon, in this big ball, and then right at the center, there was a core development team of 10, 15 people that did 85, 90% of the work. And MySQL itself, the company, did 99% of the development work. So they did get help on people reporting bugs and other things on this slightly larger circle. But yeah, we're
a pretty thankless crowd, right? Just give us the code and we won't help at all. There's a question there. I don't know.
Are there a question like the OpenSSL guys? They said that one of the problems that caused the Heart League was their lack of ability to raise enough money to keep their servers running. So what does that say? I'd be interested in your comments about this lack of big companies like Google and stuff supporting projects that they make millions of dollars from, but don't even give them a dime.
So to repeat the question, why in the heck can't OpenSSL get backing when it nearly took down the internet, right? That's crazy. It's clearly a failure on the people who are using it to recognize the value they derive from open source. It's also a failure on the open source community's part, and not sharing that or propagating that message successfully. And I don't think it's going to work in the future. I fully expect these types of things to happen more and more and more. It will take something really, really bad, as if this weren't really, really bad, and I think people's minds will start to open up a little bit. I don't know. We need get part or something on it. Bring awareness.
Red, yeah.
Yeah, you talked about how you sell services around whatever your open source product is, and I think a lot of times people think of that's directly, using the product, support for the product, and so on. But you could take, say, the Google side of things, the way Google did things. Google's not really a technology company; they're an advertising company, and their products that they create and put out is to push advertising and to be able to sell that advertising and push it to the user. So it's kind of, I think it's harder for nowadays probably to make money that way and get into that industry from that direction. But that's another way to kind of monetize what you're putting out there.
Yeah. And it's actually interesting. Google's an interesting company because they do, and I've written blog posts before calling them the biggest open source company in the world, but I actually think Facebook probably is now, in part because Google's very selective of how they contribute to the OpenSSL comment back there. And this is not to slam Google. They're a great company, and they do contribute. But I can tell you from my own company, we work really closely with Facebook, and they're actively helping us with the database because they want to make it better because they want to use it. Google uses a lot of MongoDB internally. I should know. We don't have any press here in the they don't do much contribution, we'll just say that. But it's not just us. For Linux, for MySQL, they use tons of MySQL. It's almost nothing back.
So there's a long time when they ran a Red Hat derivative, right? It was their internal operating system, but didn't really participate in the wider Red Hat ecosystem. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So you can have, I remember Michael Tiemann talking with Chris DeBona and saying, you guys bought one copy of it and then you run your business on it, pay up. And he said, well, I think we bought the one copy. And so you can have different companies that view it different way, different companies that are kind of the same, like Facebook and Google. And Facebook is all open all the time, and Google's not. So I don't have an answer for that. It's helping people see the self-interest in contributing back. And again, Facebook sees it. Twitter, I think, sees it very clearly as we not only use a lot of open source, but we understand that we need to give back to make it even better.
Even if it's not for technical reasons, that's you're buying a lot of goodwill in the community where you're trying to hire in a very competitive space. And so, the more you can get your name out there, the better.
Agreed, yeah.
I have a question real quick. So I think there's a lot of people in the world that understand that their business skills, like they can't go write software, they can't go do like bug reporting and stuff like that, but they'd like to be able to contribute. How do you get the message to those people of how they can contribute?
It's well, I can say one thing that as somebody who's constantly trying to get, and so this is coming at it from a commercial angle, but I think it works also for just a community project with no commercial backing whatsoever, and that's, you can talk about the fact that you use it. You can write a blog post about how useful it is to you. Even little things like that really matter. That larger circle that Martin Mikos talked about, that of just users, if those people are talking about it, making it safe for someone else to try the software by saying, hey, it works for us, this is how we set it up, you don't have to be that technical in order to do that. And that is actually really helpful. So, I mean, it's just one thing.
I kind of question the underlying premise of the question. I don't know. If you get so far down the chain that they are non-technical, I'll bet they stop caring pretty quick how the value is derived or that it's open source at all. I might be a little bit misguided there or cynical.
So I'm just thinking about like some of the management people at our company, because our company sells software and services, and we depend heavily on open source tools. And so a lot of times it's like, oh, well, we have this problem we need to solve. Oh, there's an open source tool for that. Great, let's use it. But how do we say thank you to that company? I mean, you know,
Letting their employees come to Openwest is the number one way. It's going to vary, right? And it's going to depend on a lot on the personalities of the people running the business. But I think, yeah, being public about using those tools and promoting them that way is probably one of the better ways.
Saw a few other hands were there. Yes.
How much of that is influenced by just the sheer fact that, I mean, even open source projects don't contribute back to the open source that they're building on. Like OpenSSL is a good example of, I've only used OpenSSL twice on the command line, but I probably used OpenSSL every day in a number of other projects or libraries that are using it on the back end, etc. And maybe those aren't even written in the same language. They don't know cryptography. So how much of that is influenced by the fact that it's not in that same problem space? And it's built on kind of a tier. Like at the end of the day, who's really contributing to the kernel source every day? I'm not.
Slacker. So I don't know. The question about the OpenSSL thing I think is interesting because we're encouraged not to do our own cryptography, and we're told we're idiots if we do, and in my case that would be true. So I have no business contributing or critiquing or even doing code review in OpenSSL. It's above my pay grade. I have not taken enough math to know that stuff. So
You submitted a kernel patch?
not a kernel. I have done a few of the projects I follow, like Postgres and FreeSwitch. So, but far more frequently than submitting patches, I will delve into the code to see what in the heck's going on. So that as a developer, that's one of the keys for me, right? That's why I use open source, because no longer is the hood on my car welded shut. That analogy works really well in my mind.
Right here.
What's the motivation for investors to come to an open source something like this? You're selling services and that.
I wish I knew. Talk to these gentlemen.
Could you do the question again? I'm sorry.
What's the motivation for an investor to come to an open source company?
What is the motivation for an investor to go to an open source company? How do you what?
Why would they bother to spend money?
Well, okay, so this is this is hard. Okay, I'll try. Your product is not your company, even if you're a product company. Is that your company is separate. Your company is how it sustains itself, how it makes money, how it and marketing and everything with that. That is what the investors look at, and the product is a means to an end. And so, with any business, is that you need to make that end very compelling to an investor. And the means to that, of being open source is just a part of the end. Does that make sense? So it's not that you attract investors just because you're open source. That's not enough. It's, no, we're going to go and dominate this market, and the only way to do that is by going open source. And then an investor is like, of course, I would like to back that, right? You have to make the end compelling, and that is your business, which is not necessarily your product.
Yeah, and married to that, the if you think about it, as a new company, what's your biggest problem? Your biggest problem isn't protecting your IP, not for most companies, because nobody cares about your IP if they don't care about your product. Your biggest problem is getting people to use your product. It's a secondary problem then to figure out how to make money from it, and that is where IP and whatnot comes in. Your first order of business as any startup is to get people using and loving your product, and open source is it's not the only way, but it's a pretty fantastic way to do that. And especially if you're going in trying to disrupt an existing industry, you've got to grease the distribution. You need to get away. You need to find ways around purchasing within these enterprises. I was talking to I had breakfast with a large bank, or a representative from a bank on Tuesday, or Monday rather, and he said, "You guys are everywhere here." And it wasn't because some sales guy or saleswoman was in there promoting it. It's because their developers were downloading it and starting projects. That is a great problem for us to have, is figuring out, okay, so they're using all this MongoDB. How do I now monetize it? I'd much rather have that problem than how do I get anybody to care about this database at all? And so I think for an investor, I mean, investors have gotten pretty savvy about this, I think, as a general rule, where they've started looking at, okay, how many downloads do you have? What's your community like? And suddenly you have tangible metrics that you can show people that say, this is a successful strategy that is helping us with our product. And then now as a business, we need to figure out all these other things. But again, I would much rather solve the adoption problem first than the monetization problem.
Yeah, I agree. I just think they go hand in hand. Right.
So as I listen to the question about how do we attract, VCs or whatever, I think sometimes there's too much focus on really big enterprise business. If I looked at the audience here, and I see a couple of my employees there, and I think the truth is that the majority of these people are going to be affected by open source, not because they have an open source model that's really attractive to VCs or other sophisticated money, but because it gives us normal, everyday Joes and Janes access to some of the most amazing technology that's ever been created. And with that, we can do amazing things in our own sphere and not have to be Facebook, not have to be Google, or not have to be the next amazing service for, time and attendance or whatever it is. But, at my humble little dev shop, the only proprietary software we have is Windows, and that's just so we can run QuickBooks, and it runs on a VM that we shut down when we're done. But other than that, it's all open source, and so there are, 40 or more people doing great things and making a great living because open source, and not because necessarily that's a part of our message. It just is a part of our culture and what we do.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'd love to get to any other questions, and then follow up with maybe what's next for open source as a business. But go ahead.
I have a little bit different angle. We're an MSP, and we're getting some wins by using open source firewalls and virtualization and just starting to play with storage to where we can beat other MSPs who are Cisco and EMC, and the customers have to pay so much money for these features that doesn't help me, doesn't help my customer, because the margins are so small anyway. So we're getting some wins with firewalls and with virtualization, but what are some pieces that I'm missing? Services that I can give small businesses, that I can take away some of those big, huge licensing costs and still provide great technology and features. And I just charge from our hourly services to take care of it on a regular basis.
So you mentioned you're not doing storage?
Well, we're playing with some storage now.
You should check out ZFS, amazing file system, and you can perform the heck out of almost everybody that's out there and do it on commodity hardware, and it'll be a first-class offering. There's probably a ton of money to be made there.
What it sounds like you're doing actually sounds really awesome already, because I think I think one of the things that I've been saying is to sell the services around it, and basically that's what you're doing, right? You're taking open source projects and then you're using them and getting them into the hands of businesses, right? And I think that that's an ideal business model. I think it works well. I think that if you get something critical, you need to. there could be working on those open source projects or starting some of your own or something like that, right? But I love the model. I think it can be very disruptive in doing that. Because, I mean, you're selling the service of it.
Yeah.
When tractions become so important to gain angel investment, what are some key ways or channels to use to get a hardware product out into the market to gain that traction?
I'll repeat the question because I'm not going to answer it. When traction is so important, is what channels do you use for hardware and distributing hardware and hardware innovation?
So I don't know the answer to that because I'm a software person as well. But what I would say, do whatever the Raspberry Pi folks have done, because like I see Raspberry Pi like show up everywhere. Like I was talking to a friend the other day he's doing a medical imaging, and he said, yeah, we started with a laptop and now we're using this Raspberry Pi board, and he's the last person on earth I would have assumed would know anything about this. So maybe you know, Gabe, but whatever they've done, that's what you should do.
I think the answer doesn't have much to do with open source. It probably has more to do with crowdsource. So.
Okay. Well, we need to wrap up. We see the other people trying to come in. So I just want to say thank you for your participation. Thank you to our panel. They are a wealth of knowledge and experience. So if you have more questions, please come and ask them. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. She'll take your questions up the side.